You ever see a grown woman in a pink bathrobe, Crocs, and a ski mask tiptoeing through a cornfield at 2 a.m. with a bottle labeled Total Vegetation Killer? Because I have, and I've got it all on camera. That was the moment I realized my neighbor Karen wasn't just eccentric, she was at war. And unfortunately for her, she picked the wrong battlefield. It all started during the 4th of July community cookout. My family and I had spent weeks preparing. Grilling gear, patriotic banners, and a special batch of sweet corn picked fresh from the edge of my property that morning. People couldn't stop raving about it. Best corn I've ever had, one guy said with butter dripping down his chin. That's when Karen, plastic wine cup in hand and her sun hat the size of a satellite dish, sidled over and said, "You really shouldn't be growing corn so close to our neighborhood. It lowers property values and attracts rodents." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She gave me a thin smile and wandered off. I chalked it up to her usual HOA drama queen antics and moved on. But that was just her opening shot. Karen had always been extra. If a leaf touched her lawn, she'd call the HOA. If someone parked too close to her driveway, even if it was her own cousin, she'd threaten towing. She once measured a neighbor's Halloween decorations with a tape measure to ensure they didn't exceed the 18-inch maximum inflatable height. But messing with my corn? That crossed a line she didn't even know existed. A week after the cookout, I noticed something strange. Several of the outer corn stalks were browning prematurely. Not just dry, splotchy, dying, sick-looking. I checked the irrigation, soil moisture, even called my old army buddy who now teaches botany. He said it looked like chemical exposure. That's when my gut told me Karen was behind it. I didn't want to believe it. But then I spotted the boot prints, fresh and muddy, leading from the road's edge straight into the crop rows. And wouldn't you know it, they were just about a size 7. Karen size. I've never been the paranoid type, but after years in military intelligence, I trust patterns. This wasn't a random incident. So I got to work. I installed a hidden trail cam in a birdhouse perched near the edge of the field. The lens was small, the range was wide, and it had night vision. My wife thought I was going overboard. I told her, if I'm wrong, we'll catch a raccoon. If I'm right, we're catching a criminal. 3 nights later, the footage came in. Karen. In a bathrobe, Croc, ski mask, holding a jug with the words, "Total Vegetation Killer," printed across the label in all cap. She crept in like some villain in a slapstick cartoon, spraying along the rows, then darting out of view every time a car passed on the road nearby. I watched the footage twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. It was the most ridiculous and infuriating thing I'd ever seen. I sent the clip to Sheriff Dave, a longtime friend who served with me overseas before he came back home and ran for local office. He called me in less than 5 minutes. "You're going to want to come down to the station," he said, "and bring that footage. I think we've got ourselves a case of horticultural homicide." The next morning, I drove to the station with a thumb drive and a bad attitude. Sheriff Dave and I watched the footage together in his office. He scratched his beard, let out a slow whistle, and said, "That's about as caught red-handed as it gets. Who does she think she is, the Roundup Reaper?" I almost laughed. Almost. But then I remembered the grant. See, this wasn't just any corn. I was working on a side project with the local university, experimental drought-resistant varieties they hoped to roll out to struggling farmers in arid zones. I was one of 3 pilot plots in the whole county. Not only had Karen trespassed, she'd damaged federally funded research crop. That upped the stakes. A lot. Before taking legal action, Dave and I decided to confront her. We walked to her house that afternoon. She opened the door wearing yoga pants and a smug grin, sipping what she claimed was cucumber spa water, but smelled suspiciously like boxed wine. When Dave asked if she'd been out near my cornfield recently, she feigned confusion. "The cornfield?" she said, blinking too much. "Oh no, I've been busy watering my herbs." Dave raised an eyebrow, and asked what kind of herbs needed industrial weed killer. That's when she made her first mistake. "Oh, that's just my own organic blend. Essential oils to repel pests and balance the crop aura," she said. I stared at her. Crop aura? What even is that? Dave, to his credit, didn't laugh until we got back to the cruiser. "We're gonna need more than a video and pseudoscience to make this stick in court," he said. "Especially if she starts spinning some home gardening nonsense." I knew what I had to do. Cameras weren't enough. I needed evidence of long-term damage, proof of motive, and, if I was lucky, a pattern. Because something told me Karen hadn't just started with my corn. She'd done this before. I returned home, climbed into the shed, and opened the file cabinet I hadn't touched in years. Inside were logbooks, maps, and a few more cameras, leftovers from my surveillance days. If Karen wanted a turf war, I was ready to play chess while she played checkers. I wasn't just protecting corn. I was protecting my land, my livelihood, and the principle that people like her don't get to win just because they're loud, entitled, and HOA adjacent. And the best part? She had no idea I'd just declared war. Sheriff Dave didn't waste any time. The morning after Karen's midnight weedkiller escapade, he showed up at her door with a copy of the footage on his tablet and a look that said, "Don't even try me." I stood beside him, arms crossed, trying not to smirk. She opened the door wearing the same Crocs she'd worn during her nocturnal mission and an expression that flickered between smugness and suspicion. Dave didn't bother with small talk. He hit play. The video was silent but damning. There she was, clear as day or night, spraying down rows of corn with a jug that could have had a skull and crossbones sticker for all the toxicity it was spewing. She squinted at the screen, blinked a few times, and then, with absolutely no shame, said, "That's not me." I coughed so hard I nearly choked on my own disbelief. Dave, ever the professional, stayed calm. "Ma'am, that's your house in the background. Your Crocs. Your robe. And what appears to be your face, even through the ski mask. It's not a very good one." Karen scoffed and folded her arms. "I was watering herbs. Maybe that's steam from my essential oil diffuser." I stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Steam. In the middle of a cornfield. At 2 in the morning. That's when she pulled her usual card, playing the victim. She said I was harassing her, claimed I had a vendetta, and even tried to report me to the HOA for unauthorized surveillance activity on my own land. She handed Sheriff Dave a crumpled warning notice she'd somehow convinced the HOA president to issue. It accused me of installing surveillance equipment in a manner that may distress or intimidate neighboring residents. Dave read it, then laughed so hard he had to step off the porch to compose himself. The HOA president, a balding man named Glenn who had the spine of a jellyfish and the people skills of a burnt toaster, called me that evening. He tried to smooth things over, saying that I shouldn't escalate matters unnecessarily, and that Karen had expressed sincere regret over any perceived wrongdoing. Perceived. He actually said that. I asked him how much HOA funding Karen controlled. He got real quiet and said he'd have to check the bylaws. I was losing patience, but the sheriff had a point. What we had looked bad, but we needed more to make it airtight. That's when I remembered something Karen didn't know. The corn she sprayed wasn't just mine. It was part of a federal research grant through the agricultural department at the local university. I had records, soil reports, and a signed contract stating the crops were experimental hybrids being tested for drought resistance. Each stalk she damaged was not just a food source. It was a data point, a line on a grant report, a small piece of something much bigger. Now, that was something you could quantify in court. I called Professor Yamada, who ran the research program. She drove out the next morning with a lab kit, a clipboard, and the energy of someone who hadn't lost a single scientific battle in 30 years. She examined the brown patches, took soil samples, and measured chemical residue. After an hour in the field, she walked up to me, pulled her sunglasses down, and said, "This is deliberate. There's commercial herbicide residue here, and it was applied in specific patterns to cause widespread but non-obvious damage. Whoever did this knew just enough to be dangerous. I pointed toward Karen's yard. Yamada nodded grimly and said, "I hope she knows a good lawyer." Meanwhile, the damage was spreading. Not physically. The chemical effects had already peaked, but socially. 2 neighbors approached me separately that week to say their garden beds were dying too. One woman said her daughter's pumpkin patch turned black overnight. Another guy said his tomatoes shriveled up like raisins, even though the weather had been perfect. Each of them had seen Karen walking nearby with her infamous jug, though none of them had proof. Until now, none had dared to speak up. But after seeing her caught on camera, they were ready to talk. I compiled statements, mapped locations, even layered them onto a satellite image of the neighborhood with a handy red X over each spot where crops had mysteriously failed. The pattern was undeniable, and it always traced back to the border of Karen's yard. It looked less like a neighborhood and more like a battlefield with precision chemical strike. One night, as I reviewed footage, I caught something new. Karen wasn't alone. A man, stocky, wearing a hoodie, was handing her something from the trunk of his car. The container matched the Weedkiller jug exactly. I paused the footage, zoomed in. The license plate was partially visible. Bingo. I showed Dave the video the next day. He ran the plate and found it linked to a landscaping supply wholesaler outside city limits, one that didn't usually sell to the public. A quick visit revealed that Karen had bought a high-strength, commercial-grade herbicide under the pretense of treating invasive bamboo. There wasn't a single bamboo plant within a mile of her house. Dave's jaw tightened. This isn't just trespass. This is intentional property destruction using unlicensed chemicals. And if she's done it more than once, we might be looking at felony charges. He called the county DA for a consult. Things were heating up faster than I expected. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down. She printed out flyers accusing me of spying on residents, stapled them to the HOA bulletin board, and even left one on my mailbox with the words, "This isn't over," scrawled in red Sharpie. I took it as a compliment. If she was rattled, that meant I was closing in. But the most surprising twist came 3 days later. An anonymous letter appeared in my mailbox. No return address, no signature, just one line. Check the HOA meeting notes from March. Rezoning agenda. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but curiosity got the better of me. I went online, logged into the community site, and found the meeting minutes buried under outdated pool rules and a bake sale announcement. And there it was. Karen had proposed a rezoning discussion for aesthetic improvements and community recreation expansion, which included a tennis court plan, on land directly bordering my cornfield, my land. And while the notes didn't say it outright, the implication was obvious. If my field disappeared, so would the zoning obstacle. I stared at the screen for a long time. This wasn't about corn. It never had been. Karen wasn't just being annoying. She was trying to destroy my livelihood to clear a path for her pet project. That changed everything. Now it wasn't just petty sabotage. It was strategic. And I had the footage, the evidence, and the motive. The next morning, Sheriff Dave called. His voice was low and serious. "You ready to press charges?" he asked. I looked out over my damaged field, then toward Karen's house, where her stupid garden gnome smiled smugly from the flower bed like it had been in on it the whole time. "Let's do it," I said. Professor Yamada wasn't the type to mince words. After the sheriff's call, she returned to my property with a small team of students and a portable lab setup in her van. She moved like a general inspecting a battlefield, kneeling between rows of shriveled corn, nodding silently, occasionally jotting notes. The team gathered soil and root samples, took high-resolution photos, and measured chemical concentrations with the kind of precision that left no room for ambiguity. When she finally stood up and dusted off her hands, she turned to me and said, "This wasn't just an attack on your property. It's sabotage against the entire research program." She wasn't angry. She was furious. While Yamada worked, I gathered everything I had. Camera footage, GPS-tagged timestamps, statements from neighbors, copies of HOA documents, receipts I'd found online from that sketchy landscape wholesaler. I even found old texts from Karen where she jokingly said my corn was an eyesore, and that she wished something would happen to it. They didn't hold much legal weight, but when stacked on top of everything else, they painted a picture of motive that was hard to ignore. Sheriff Dave was busy behind the scenes. He called the state agriculture department to file a formal contamination report and opened a case file with the county prosecutor's office. Then, to my surprise, he showed up one morning with an envelope of photos he'd gotten from one of Karen's other neighbors. Inside were shots of Karen walking along the side of the road, Weedkiller jug in hand, approaching flower beds, gardens, and once, even someone's mailbox planter. I couldn't believe it. She hadn't just targeted me. She'd been on a chemical rampage across the whole neighborhood. It was around that time that word really started to spread. One neighbor posted on the community page about her dying rose bushes. Another added a picture of her lawn, which had strange discoloration in the same snake-like pattern I'd seen in my cornfield. Karen tried to dismiss it all, calling the complaints a smear campaign and blaming soil fungus, but the damage was done. Suddenly, I wasn't the only one at war with her. I had a dozen angry gardeners, a furious professor, and a very interested sheriff all ready to bring her down. But the twist came the following weekend, when a young man named Jordan knocked on my door. He was maybe 25, nervous, and holding a folder full of papers. He introduced himself as a former intern for Glenn, the HOA president. He said he'd been asked to shred some documents a few months ago but made digital copies, just in case. When I asked why he was showing me now, he looked down at his shoes and said, "Because I never thought they'd go this far. I didn't sign up for this." Inside that folder were minutes from several off-the-record meetings between Karen, Glenn, and a few other HOA board members. They included phrases like eliminating obstructions to beautification initiatives, accelerating rezoning through community pressure, and even a note that read, "Chemical mitigation, discreet only." I stared at that line for a long time. Chemical mitigation. That wasn't an accident. That was deliberate planning. Jordan also had a PDF proposal dated 6 months prior, drawn up by a company called Green Sky Quartz, Karen's brother's business. The proposal included diagrams of a tennis court complex that would sit partly on HOA greenbelt space and partly on private land. My land. Land they clearly hoped I'd lose interest in once my crops were dead and useless. I brought everything straight to Dave. He read through it silently, then looked up and said, "We've got conspiracy to commit property damage, intent to defraud through rezoning manipulation, and probable cause for a search warrant on both Karen and Glenn." He made a few calls, and within hours, he had the green light to proceed. The next morning, patrol cars rolled up to Karen's house and the HOA office. No sirens, no dramatic takedown, but official enough that neighbors peeked out through blinds and dogs barked from behind fences. Officers entered both locations, emerging with files, hard drives, and Karen herself, red-faced, ranting, and demanding they unhand her. She shouted that this was a misogynistic attack on her leadership, and that she had rights, which, of course, no one was denying. But rights don't include poisoning crops and orchestrating a land grab under the guise of community improvement. Meanwhile, Glenn was nowhere to be found. His office was empty, his house dark. Dave suspected he was trying to run. But 2 days later, he turned himself in after learning there was a warrant out for him and his HOA bank accounts had been frozen pending investigation. The entire neighborhood felt like it had flipped overnight. People who had been silent before now spoke up. One woman admitted Karen had screamed at her child for stepping 1 inch onto her sidewalk. Another confessed that Glenn had once threatened her with fines over a sunflower pot she put too close to the curb. Suddenly, the tyrants of the HOA weren't untouchable anymore. They were exposed. Vulnerable. Beat. I expected Karen to deny everything, but to my surprise, she started shifting blame. She told the sheriff she was misled by Glenn, that he'd told her it was necessary maintenance, and that she didn't understand what was in the chemical container. That didn't explain the ski mask, or the fact that she bought the product under a fake name, or the documents she signed. But it was clear her plan had fallen apart, and now she was scrambling. Back on my land, Professor Yamada gave me some hopeful news. While the damage was significant, it was localized. Some of the soil could be remediated, and enough data had been preserved to justify continuing the research next season. The grant wouldn't be pulled. The university stood by me. I'd even been asked to speak at a conference about the importance of protecting agricultural projects from private interference. It wasn't the ending I'd planned, but it wasn't a loss either. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sunset blaze across the sky behind my surviving rows of corn. My wife came out, holding a printout of the latest community board post. Karen's mugshot had leaked, and someone had turned it into a meme. Cornspiracy Queen, it read, complete with a little crown made of corn husks photoshopped onto her head. We both laughed harder than we had in weeks. But I knew it wasn't over yet. The trial was coming, and if the early evidence was any indication, Karen's tangled web of lies was about to unravel in court. And I was going to enjoy every second of it. The courtroom was packed. It wasn't just lawyers and a few curious residents. People came in from the next town over to watch the spectacle. Folding chairs had been added in the back. The bailiff looked more like a bouncer at a nightclub than a court officer. There was a buzz in the air, like the kind before a storm hits, a tense hush mixed with expectation and a hint of popcorn in the microwave kind of drama. Karen sat at the defendant's table, stiff-backed in a beige pantsuit that looked like it had been ironed by someone who had never felt joy. Her expression flickered between defiance and dread. Glenn sat beside her, visibly sweating, his tie undone like he'd been dragged there against his will. If this was their plan to look pitiful, it was working too well. They looked like two toddlers who got caught finger-painting the Constitution. The prosecution wasted no time. The state had picked up the case after the university and the agricultural department pushed hard for formal charges. The list was long. Trespassing, property destruction, unlawful use of restricted herbicides, and conspiracy to manipulate zoning laws for personal gain. The kicker? Misuse of public office through the HOA to benefit a private company, Karen's brother's tennis court business. When that last charge was read aloud, I saw Karen's neck stiffen like she'd swallowed a tennis ball. The prosecution began with the video, the infamous clip of Karen in her robe, Crocs, and ski mask, waddling through my cornfield like a villain in a dollar store soap opera. The moment it played on the screen, the gallery reacted. Suppressed laughter rippled through the rows, and even the judge had to take a long sip from his mug before addressing the jury with a stone-cold face. "Please disregard any personal reactions to the footage," he said, though his eyes twinkled with disbelief. Karen's lawyer stood up and objected on the grounds that the video was unfairly prejudicial due to its theatrical appearance. The judge responded flatly, "It's prejudicial because she did it dressed like that. That's not the court's fault." Then came the documents, emails between Karen and Glenn, meeting notes from their unrecorded HOA planning sessions, and the tennis court proposal with my land highlighted in faint yellow. It was damning. Jordan, the former intern, took the stand next and delivered his testimony with a steady, remorseful tone. He told the jury about being asked to delete files, to avoid taking meeting notes, and even about Karen laughing once after a closed-door session, saying, "Once that cornfield's dead, it'll all fall into place." I watched Karen's jaw clench with every new revelation. Her lawyer kept trying to spin the narrative, that she was misled, manipulated, that she only wanted to improve the community. But every time he made a claim, the prosecution pulled up more evidence. The purchase receipt for the herbicide. The footage of her picking it up from the unregistered dealer. A text to Glenn that said, The less corn, the less resistance. The more they tried to justify her actions, the more her house of cards wobbled. Then came the scientific testimony. Professor Yamada took the stand with charts, photos, and a serious expression that made her look like someone about to launch a rocket instead of explain corn damage. She explained the crop's value, the federal grant, and the precise impact of the chemicals used. She held up samples and photos of wilted stalks with chemical burns at the root. She made it clear that this wasn't a mistake or an accident, it was intentional, targeted destruction. You don't accidentally apply this specific compound in such concentrated doses across patterned rows, she said. You don't mistakenly carry out chemical sabotage in the dead of night while wearing a disguise. The defense didn't cross-examine much after that. But it wasn't just science and legalese. The neighbors took the stand, one by one, painting a picture of life under Karen's HOA rule. Stories poured out about absurd fines, threats of legal action over lawn decorations, and how Karen routinely overstepped her authority, always acting like she was queen of the cul-de-sac. One older gentleman said she fined him for using the wrong shade of beige on his mailbox post. "There's only so many shades of beige, Your Honor," he said, earning a rare chuckle from the bench. Then came the bombshell. The state's investigator introduced a financial audit of the HOA's discretionary spending over the past 2 years. It revealed that Glenn had approved reimbursements for landscape consultations that led directly to Karen's brother's company, before any official proposals had even been made. That sealed the conspiracy angle. They weren't just planning to benefit from rezoning. They were already funneling HOA funds to set the groundwork. Karen's demeanor cracked. She went from stiff and silent to visibly twitchy, tapping her fingers, shifting in her seat. At one point, when a witness referenced her campaign of chemical terror, she muttered something under her breath loud enough that her own lawyer had to lean in and shush her. Her spiral had officially begun. Glenn, meanwhile, looked like a deflated pool float. He barely responded to questions and finally requested a private meeting with his attorney, which resulted in him entering a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Karen, he'd get a reduced sentence and a hefty fine but no jail time. His testimony was the final nail. He admitted to knowing about the chemical use, greenlighting the plan, and using HOA meetings to lay the groundwork for discrediting me as uncooperative and aggressively territorial. When the jury left for deliberation, the room was electric. It felt like a long exhale, like everyone had been holding their breath for hours. But they didn't take long, less than 90 minutes. They returned with verdicts on all counts, guilty. Karen's reaction was something I'll never forget. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at the judge, slack-jawed, as if the reality finally landed. The community golden girl turned HOA tyrant had just been legally declared a criminal. Her brother's company? Banned from receiving any HOA contracts indefinitely. The judge gave her 60 days to pay restitution to every damaged party, including me, the university, and even the neighbors whose yards she destroyed. Her probation would include 200 hours of community service, ironically, involving landscaping under supervision. The courthouse emptied into a crowd outside. Reporters were waiting. Locals cheered. Someone had even brought a sign that said, "Corn Lives Matter." Sheriff Dave found me near the courthouse steps and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Told you we'd get her," he said. "You got more footage left?" I laughed and told him, "Only the blooper reel." But the best part wasn't the verdict. It came a week later when I walked past the town's community garden. There, in the back corner, hunched in the dirt, pulling weeds with a sour expression and a neon vest that said "Court-Ordered Service," was Karen. She spotted me, froze for a second, then turned back to digging. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking. Justice didn't always look like a gavel hitting a bench. Sometimes, it looked like a former HOA dictator weeding cucumbers for the people she once tried to control. The strange thing about revenge is that when it finally arrives, It doesn't always feel like fireworks or thunder. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, like the rustle of wind through healthy stalks of corn you thought were lost. After everything, after the cameras, the courtroom, the yelling, the neighborhood turning itself inside out, peace crept back in like a sunrise. Slowly. But you could feel it warming your skin all the same. Karen's fall from grace spread faster than her Weedkiller ever could. Within days of the verdict, the HOA board held an emergency meeting, not in the usual fancy clubhouse with complimentary coffee and finger sandwiches, but in the public library's basement. Every board member tied to the rezoning scheme either resigned or was voted out by a furious crowd of homeowners. The new president? A retired kindergarten teacher named Edna, who once told Karen her American flag wreath was not a holiday hazard. Edna took one look at the existing bylaws and said, "Half of this is nonsense," then proceeded to delete more rules in 30 minutes than the previous board had written in 5 years. People cheered. Someone brought cookies. It felt like the end of a dictatorship and the start of a block party. As for Karen, she wasn't just booted from the HOA, she was banned. Not just from board positions, but from attending meetings, voting on issues, or even submitting complaints. It was like she'd been erased from the rulebook she once weaponized. Her social standing collapsed overnight. The neighbors she once bullied now ignored her like she was invisible. Her only real audience was the occasional teenager driving by to catch a glimpse of her in her neon vest, doing community service in the very gardens she'd tried to destroy. One of the stranger consequences came when her brother's company, Green Sky Courts, pulled out of the area completely. The business took a hit after the scandal, and it didn't take long before the state investigated its contract history elsewhere. Apparently, Karen's stunt wasn't a one-time thing. The company had a habit of sneaking into rezoning projects with suspicious speed and suspiciously willing HOA partners. Her brother ended up slapped with multiple fines and a temporary ban on municipal contract. Last I heard, he was trying to rebrand under a different name in another county. But that name followed him like a shadow. Meanwhile, the university renewed the grant. Professor Yamada returned, this time with even more support, and offered to help expand the field. We doubled the size of the plot, added a soil purification project, and installed new monitoring systems. Ironically, some of that funding came from a legal settlement the HOA had to pay for failing to stop Karen's activities despite having knowledge of them. I used part of it to build a small greenhouse and another part to upgrade my camera system, just in case history tried to repeat itself. But the moment that really brought it full circle came during the town's Fall Harvest Festival. I'd been invited to speak about the resilience of community agriculture. They even gave me a little ribbon to wear. I brought a crate of my corn, freshly picked that morning, and set up a booth next to the firehouse chili stand. People came by to ask questions, share stories, and of course, take home a few ears of corn. It was a good day. Bright, crisp, the kind of day that makes you believe the land remembers who takes care of it. And then, just as I was packing up, I noticed someone off to the side. Karen. Standing behind a booth sponsored by the Parks and Recreation Department, offering flyers on sustainable gardening as part of her community service hours. Her expression was blank, almost robotic. She handed out the pamphlets without looking people in the eye, probably praying no one recognized her. But they did. You could see it in the way they smirked, in the polite but forced thank yous that sounded more like jokes than gratitude. She saw me too, but didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her silence was the loudest apology she was ever going to give. I left the festival feeling lighter than I had in months. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about watching a community right itself after being bent by one person's ego, about knowing that even if you plant something and someone tries to poison it, you can come back stronger, smarter, and with better fences. Weeks passed. The cornfield healed. So did I. One morning, just as the sun was rising, I walked the edge of the field and saw something new, rows of green, pushing up from where the damaged crops had once stood. Not just surviving, thriving. I smiled, pulled my jacket tight against the chill, and kept walking. A few days later, I had an idea. Just a little something. A final touch. I built a scarecrow. Not just any scarecrow. This one had a pink bathrobe, some knockoff Crocs, and a little plastic jug taped to one hand. The other hand held a sign that read, "I weed where I shouldn't." I planted it right at the edge of the field facing Karen's house. The neighborhood thought it was hilarious. Even Edna asked for a selfie with it. Karen never mentioned it. She just avoided looking that direction altogether. Eventually, things returned to normal. The HOA got quieter. The gardens grew again. People started waving to each other more. You could tell folks were just relieved to have their neighborhood back. Not perfect, but better. More honest. Less afraid. As for me, I kept farming. Kept fixing fences and checking cameras and planting new seed. Not just in the ground, but in the community. The whole ordeal taught me something. That even when someone tries to bury you, if you stay rooted, you'll rise again. Taller, stronger, and more determined than ever. Because in the end, justice isn't always a courtroom. Sometimes it's a cornfield that grows back, no matter how hard someone tried to kill it. And sometimes it's a scarecrow in a bathrobe reminding everyone exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong farmer.